There are many different ways in which we can judge the best fighter in boxing. Typically, the Fighter of the Decade award has awarded the best fighter across a 10-year span. Now, whilst the Fighter of the Decade award typically does cover the greatest fighter across that era, lots of history's greatest fighters do fall through the cracks with this system. So I decided to dig a little bit deeper and cover the greatest fighters across every 5-year period. Now, this isn't a foolproof system. There are still some fighters that were at their absolute best across eras from, let's say, 1998 to 2003. This is only really going to cover 5 years from 2000 to 2004, 2005 to 2009. So fighters will fall through those cracks. However, this gives you more of an understanding and a wider depth of the greatest fighters across history. Now, starting off with the last 5 years, I'm going to cover 2020 to 2024. And in my opinion, the greatest fighter across this 5-year period has been Oleksandr Usyk. Usyk across this era has basically won all of his meaningful fights at heavyweight, defeating Anthony Joshua twice, Tyson Fury twice, and Daniel Dubois. Usyk won the heavyweight titles and became the undisputed champion, the first undisputed champion since Lennox Lewis 25 years prior. And not only that, he jumped up from cruiserweight where he had cleaned up in the late 2010s and basically beaten all of the formidable, most meaningful heavyweights in the world in the 3 champions of his era, Fury, Dubois and Joshua. And he'd done so convincingly, with Fury and Joshua twice and with Dubois in this time period once. In 2025, he would ultimately score a knockout in the rematch. He was awarded the Fighter of the Year award in this time period once, his second win after winning it in 2018. But ultimately, it was the way in which Usyk challenged himself more than anyone else in this time period. You have Terence Crawford beating Canelo in 2025. And I think Terence Crawford's masterclass over Errol Spence puts him very high in the category for winning this one, as does Naoya Inoue's complete destruction of the super bantamweight division. But for me, the best fighter from 2020 to 2024 was the legendary Oleksandr Usyk, who in my opinion cemented himself as an all-time great in these years. Now, moving on to 2015 to 2019, I think I'll actually start with some honourable mentions before I name my fighter. The face of boxing in this time period was Canelo Alvarez. There were those 2 legendary fights against Gennady Golovkin in this time period, a win against an aging Miguel Cotto, who was middleweight champion, and a Fighter of the Year award winner in 2019 against Sergey Kovalev, winning via knockout and defeating Danny Jacobs. You also have Gennady Golovkin, who I would put as a very strong contender in this 5-year period. Now, this was actually Golovkin beginning to slow down across 2015 to 2019. He really primed when he was Fighter of the Year in 2013. However, he did have those big fights against Canelo Alvarez in 2017 and 2018, one in which being a draw and the other being a loss. But I think he certainly won at least one of those fights, and in my opinion, won both. He obviously beat Danny Jacobs, Kell Brook, and had one of his best performances against David Lemieux in this time period. But none of those guys would be number one. For me, the standout is Vasyl Lomachenko. He's who I'm going to award in this 5-year period. Lomachenko was at his absolute peak in this time period when he became Nomaschenko. From 2015, he defeated Rocky Martinez to become a 2-division champion after just 7 fights, and had stopped Nicholas Walters and Guillermo Rigondeaux, both when those guys were in their prime. There was the exceptional fight against Jorge Linares, a very good victory over Jose Pedraza, a stoppage over Anthony Crolla, and Luke Campbell, who he defeated on points. All in all, Lomachenko conquered 2 of his 3 divisions in this time period and went 11-0 with 9 knockouts. This was prime Vasyl Lomachenko. Now, moving on to 2010 to 2014, Andre Ward was an exceptional fighter at this time period, where he'd won the Super 6 tournament, scored victories over the likes of Arthur Abraham, Carl Froch, Chad Dawson, and recently beaten Mikkel Kessler. Sergio Martinez would certainly be a front runner with his devastating defeats over Paul Williams and Kelly Pavlik, stopping future champion Darren Barker, Sir Hasten Zurich and Julio Cesar Chavez, who he beat on points. However, there was the loss to Miguel Cotto in 2014, but ultimately the pound-for-pound star of the sport and the undeniable dominant figure in boxing was Floyd Mayweather Jr. across these years. Mayweather had 7 fights across these 5 years, defeating a younger version of Canelo Alvarez and scoring one of his more impressive victories against Miguel Cotto. There was a tough fought fight against Marcos Maidana, which he ultimately won and comfortably won the rematch. The victory over Robert Guerrero, Victor Ortiz and Shane Mosley in this time. Mayweather had become the pound for pound and the pay-per-view star of boxing across this time period and would ultimately extend that dominance in both fields into the late 2010s. Defeating the likes of Manny Pacquiao and Andre Berto, and eventually Conor McGregor in 2017. Now moving on to 2005 to 2009. There's only one name here for me. I mean, Floyd Mayweather was in absolutely incredible form across these years. Joe Calzaghe was in some of the best form of his entire career, but it's Manny Pacquiao. This was Manny Pacquiao's prime, one of the greatest primes in boxing history. From 2005 to 2009, Pacquiao went 11-1 with 8 knockouts. The one defeat he did suffer against Erik Morales, he avenged twice. Pacquiao started this time period jumping up to super featherweight. He had recently boxed at featherweight, where ultimately the jump up to super featherweight he would lose to Erik Morales, but he stopped Morales twice in fights at super featherweight. There was the rematch against Juan Manuel Marquez, in which he won a split decision in what was one of his closer fights in this time. He then went on a 3-fight obliteration, jumping 3 different weight divisions, where he smashed David Diaz at lightweight, absolutely obliterated Oscar De La Hoya, as he did with Ricky Hatton at light welterweight. He then moved up to welterweight and stopped Miguel Cotto in what was one of the best performances of his career. In 2010, he went up to super welterweight and absolutely peppered Antonio Margarito. In total, Pacquiao boxed across 5 different weight divisions in these 5 years and beat everyone he faced in some of the most brutal beatdowns boxing's ever seen. It's undeniably one of the most impressive prime years ever. Now moving on to 2000 to 2004. My winner here is Bernard Hopkins, who was in his executioner phase. And Bernard went 9-0 with 5 knockouts in these 5 years. He won the Fighter of the Year award in 2001 and became the undisputed middleweight champion. Now what I always find so impressive about Hopkins is the longevity, because he was the best fighter, in my opinion, from 2000 to 2005. And over 10 years later, at the age of 50, he was still winning the top fights and competing with pound for pound stars. But when you look into this run from 2000 to 2004, it's phenomenal. He had multiple unification fights, defeating Keith Holmes, Felix Trinidad, and ultimately Oscar De La Hoya to become the undisputed middleweight champion. And around that, consistently retained his middleweight titles that he'd won in 1995. At the age of 32, it's incredible to think a 32-year-old fighter who would go on to rule the middleweight division and become undisputed champion till the age of 38 would still be winning titles 19 years after his 32nd birthday. And what's most impressive about those big wins, plus the further wins against the likes of William Joppy, Robert Allen, Carl Daniels, but what's most impressive about the De La Hoya and the Trinidad wins is the fact that he stopped both of those fighters too. Right, now moving on to the late 1990s, and there's only one man that stands out in this bracket for me, and that's Roy Jones Jr., who across these 5 years went 13-1 with 10 knockouts. Now it's important to register the fact that one defeat was a disqualification loss after hitting a downed opponent against Montel Griffin, and he avenged that with a first round knockout in the rematch. But Jones in this time period was just almost superhuman. He retained the IBF super middleweight titles that he won off James Toney successfully 5 times, and moved up to win 3 different light heavyweight titles, beating the likes of an aged Mike McCallum, Virgil Hill, Montel Griffin, Vinny Pazienza, who he absolutely demolished. I think it's one of those few fights in which there was a round in which he didn't even take a punch. I mean, Jones was superhuman in this time period, completely dominating his opposition. The only thing you could say is there was a stretch of sort of easier opponents compared to other patches in his career. Ultimately, in the 2000s, he would move up to heavyweight, where he would defeat John Ruiz. He would fight Antonio Tarver. But Jones in this time period was just untouchable. Now, the late 90s, there's a clear number one, in my opinion anyway. I mean, Lennox Lewis was in very good form, but not as good as Roy Jones Jr. across those years. But for the early 90s, it gets a little bit trickier because there are two standouts. Now, Pernell Whitaker was in some of the best form of his career. In my opinion, I think he deserved to get the victory over Julio Cesar Chavez, who was undefeated. He beat Buddy McGirt a few times, Jorge Paez, Rafael Pineda, but ultimately didn't really have the top level wins that Chavez had. Chavez and Whitaker dominated the top two pound for pound slots across 90 to 94. And whilst ultimately I think you can make a claim that Whitaker never lost a fight in this time period and defeated Chavez across these years, although it was officially scored a draw, I think everyone considers that a Whitaker victory. I think Chavez was the best fighter in this time period. I think he had the better resume of opposition, the more impactful wins and the more impactful fights early on. And I just think he was a lot busier too. Chavez went 24-1-1 with 22 knockouts in the early 90s. He had that sensational unification victory against Meldrick Taylor where he pulled a devastating knockout, a dramatic knockout in the last seconds of the fight in an absolute classic, one of the greatest fights of all time. He also defeated Greg Horgan, who was a very good fighter, plus the win over Hector Camacho. He lost to Frankie Randall, but ultimately avenged the rematch and beat Meldrick Taylor a second time via TKO. There was the draw to Pernell Whitaker, which, as I say, I think he lost that fight. But ultimately, in those early years, Chavez was just such a force at light welterweight, with his 12 successful title victories at light welterweight in this 5-year period. On top of that, he was just such an icon of the sport too. His fights meant so much to the Mexican people. His fight at the Azteca Stadium against Greg Horgan had over 100,000 people there. For my 1990 to 1994, I am going to favour Julio Cesar Chavez, but you could easily put Pernell Whitaker in that spot. Now, moving on to the late 1980s. The 1980s, in my opinion, besides the 1940s, is the most stacked decade in boxing history. Honourable mentions could go to Evander Holyfield, who went on his undisputed cruiserweight run from 1986 up to 1988, where he eventually moved up to heavyweight. But in that run, he beat Carlos De Leon, Dwight Muhammad Qawi twice, one of which was one of the most brutal fights you'd ever wish to see over the 15-round era. Henry Tillman, and was one of the all-time great cruiserweights. Until Oleksandr Usyk done what he done at cruiserweight, Holyfield was the man at cruiserweight historically. You also have the very good Mike Spinks, who established himself as one of the all-time great light heavyweights and moved up to beat Larry Holmes twice for the heavyweight world titles, plus a win against Jerry Cooney. It just gets overshadowed by the loss to Mike Tyson. Marvin Hagler was on top of the world in this time. He had those incredible fights against John Mugabe and Tommy Hearns, but ultimately lost the 1987 clash to Sugar Ray Leonard and never fought again, so he wasn't as active across those years. But for me, the standout has to be Mike Tyson. These were Mike Tyson's prime years. Across the years, he went 37-0 with 33 knockouts. Pretty much every impactful thing Tyson done and his legacy was achieved in these years. I know that he went on to become a 2-time heavyweight champion after, but he was never the same force that he was in his destructive prime years from 1986 to 1989. It just encapsulated everything that made Tyson an absolute superstar. The fear factor, the devastating wins against Hall of Famers in Mike Spinks and Larry Holmes. Tyson successfully retained the heavyweight titles 9 times in this time. He stopped Trevor Berbick in 2 rounds to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history and became the undisputed heavyweight champion and the biggest star in sports. Now, with hindsight, you can say Tyson fell off in 1990. His prime never lasted. He's not as great as some people will wish to think. But in these years, Tyson was deemed unbeatable. He was absolutely devastating the heavyweight scene of the late 1980s. And topping the pound for pound rankings, I think he has to go in this slot. Now, the early 80s is even more difficult. I mean, talk about stacked. Aaron Pryor beat Alexis Arguello in one of the greatest fights ever. Arguello himself went on that legendary lightweight campaign You had Marvin Hagler, who won the middleweight titles, but didn't quite get those legacy-defining victories other than the Roberto Duran fight, which was quite a close one, considering the weight jump Duran had done from being a lightweight champion years prior. You had Salvador Sanchez, who was on an absolute tear-up, on a path to potentially being the greatest boxer of all time, where he defeated Asuma Nelson, Wilfredo Gomez, Juan Laporte, Danny Lopez a few times. There are just so many great fighters in this era, probably some that I'm missing too. Tommy Hearns became the welterweight champion. But for me, you have to give it to Sugar Ray Leonard. Sugar Ray Leonard in these years embarked on multiple of the greatest fights of all time. Now statistically, he wasn't the busiest. He went 7-1 with 7 knockouts. And that one defeat was to Roberto Duran, but it was of such a high skill level in the brawl in Montreal that it's one of the greatest fights of all time. And ultimately he showed his class, he showed his ability to adapt and outclass one of the greatest fighters ever in the rematch in the no-mass victory. He also stopped Tommy Hearns in another one of the greatest fights of all time. Moved up to defeat Ayub Kaluli, to win light middleweight titles, and absolutely starched Davey Boy Green with one of his greatest career knockouts. The 7 knockouts in 7 wins just shows that spite and that killer instinct that Sugar Ray Leonard had in his prime. You know, the Tommy Hearns fight where he was down on the cards, he needed to pull out a victory in the 13th round. And he lets his hands go with some of the most venomous combinations you could ever wish to see so late in a fight. Ultimately, he did spend a few years out of the ring in this time period too, which does slightly take away, but the impactful fights and legacy that he left in the early 1980s, for me, he has to be number one on this list. Then we go to the 1970s, which similarly is just such a stacked decade. The fighter of the decade across the entire 70s is Roberto Duran. He went 56-1 across the entire 10-year span. Having multiple fights before that and multiple fights after, eventually extended that to 72-1 with 56 knockouts. But across the last 5 years, Duran went 22-0 with 14 KOs. This was towards the back end of his phenomenal lightweight title run, which lasted just shy of 7 years and consisted of 12 successful defences with 11 knockouts. Now, when you actually judge Duran as an overall fighter, with what he'd done in the 1980s too, at welterweight, middleweight and junior middleweight, and even light heavyweight, people look at him as if he lost those big fights to Hagler, Hearns and Leonard, and they forget that as a lightweight in the 1970s, he emulated Hagler's sole run as middleweight champion as a lightweight, because the statistics are practically the same. Hagler was middleweight champion for 6.5 years with 12 defences and 11 via knockout. Same as Duran's at lightweight. But he had so many tough fighters that he beat as a lightweight champion. Across these years, he beat Sol Manby, who was the future light welterweight champion. Villamar Fernandez, a man so good, he defeated Alexis Arguello. Edwin and Adolfo Viroet, 2 top lightweight contenders in the 70s. He stopped Esteban de Jesus, who in my opinion should be a Hall of Famer, and was the only man to defeat Roberto Duran in the 70s. His lightweight run was probably the greatest we've ever seen, alongside Benny Leonard. I think Benny Leonard goes underrated in that conversation, but what makes Duran's 5-year window stand apart is the fact that he jumped from 135 pounds all the way up to 147 pounds. And he boxed Carlos Palomino, who goes under the radar these days. But Palomino was a Hall of Fame welterweight champion with quite a lot of successful defences. And he'd only lost the title months earlier to the legendary Wilfred Benitez via split decision over 15 rounds. So Duran moved up to take on the ex-champion, who was coming off a pretty legendary reign. And he absolutely schooled Palomino over 10 rounds to make himself the leading contender in the welterweight division for Sugar Ray Leonard's title, which he ultimately won in 1980. It's one of the greatest primes ever overall, but for me there's no debate that Duran is number one in this category. Now obviously when we look at the 1970s, you think of the 3 heavyweight kings, Ali, Frazier and Foreman. And Muhammad Ali certainly could be a standout in the late 70s. He did lose to Leon Spinks, in a huge upset, although he avenged that defeat and ultimately scored the thriller and Manila victory against Joe Frazier, amongst a few others. But the early 70s, Muhammad Ali was in his best years of the 70s. You know, there was the fight of the century against Joe Frazier, that incredible Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman, Floyd Patterson fight, the Bob Foster knockout, the Ken Norton victories. I mean, you could easily pick Muhammad Ali for this. However, he did lose the fight to Joe Frazier, but similarly to Sugar Ray Leonard, I don't take that away from him because it was such a legendary fight, such a great fight. But Ali also did lose to Ken Norton, who's an extremely underrated fighter. And although he did win the next 2 fights, I personally feel that Norton deserved to win that trilogy. I think Norton won the 3rd fight too. Now, typically, you would just put Muhammad Ali as number 1. It's the easiest answer to put. However, you've got to remember how stacked the 1970s were. And Roberto Duran was on an absolute tear-up where he defeated Ken Buchanan. Esteban de Jesus, although he did lose to Jesus in these years. But I wouldn't even put Roberto Duran number 1 from 70 to 74. There's one standout that I think you just cannot ignore and was undeniably, in my opinion, the most dominant fighter pound for pound in boxing across these years. And it's the Argentinian middleweight champion of the world, Carlos Monzon, who completely dominated the middleweight division across 7 years of the 1970s. He won the title in 1970 and across the 5-year stretch went 21-0 with 17 knockouts. His resume is legendary in this time. He defeated Nino Benvenuti, a Hall of Fame middleweight, twice via knockout. Defeated one of the greatest pound for pound fighters of all time in Emil Griffith, twice, one via knockout and one on points within these 5 years. He also stopped one of the all-time great welterweights moving up in Jose Napoles, adding a knockout over Tony Mundine, one of the most underrated fighters of all time in Benny Briscoe, a victory over Jean-Claude Bautier, plus others, and this was over the 15-round era too. Most of these fights are 15 rounds. He successfully retained the middleweight titles 11 times across his 14 successful defences in his career, and in the late 70s too, he would beat the really good Rodrigo Valdez twice. Rodrigo Valdez had one of the greatest fights you could wish to see that no one ever talks about against Benny Briscoe. And he was the only man to knock Benny Briscoe out cold. So that's a really good fighter. And Monzon beat him twice. Monzon is one of the most devastating, dominating fighters in history. He was actually in this time period where he won those 20-odd fights on the back of an 81 fight unbeaten streak. He lost 3 of his first 19 and never lost again, retiring after his 100th professional fight. An absolute beast. He had over 60 knockouts. Yeah, just a monster of a man, and definitely the front runner for the early 70s. Now, for the late 1960s, my pick is going to go to Muhammad Ali, who was in his sensational prime, and in my opinion was the most diverse heavyweight we've ever seen in these years. Ali went 9-0 with 7 knockouts in his original reign as heavyweight champion. He was ultimately forced out of boxing, banned in 1967 after stopping Zora Foley. But when you actually look at Muhammad Ali, you wouldn't necessarily put him as a notable puncher. But he stopped Floyd Patterson, Sonny Liston, Henry Cooper, Carl Mildenberger and Cleveland Williams, amongst others in this time period. Ali was just so diverse. He was so good, so fast in these years. I mean, there's 2 all-time greats there in Patterson and Liston. He originally won the title off Liston in 1964. And these 9 defences were just revolutionary for the heavyweight division. There's never been a heavyweight that has emulated what Ali did in these years inside the ring with his style. I think Oleksandr Usyk would be the closest we've seen in regards to a style like a prime Ali. I mean, you know, it's completely different in regards to the southpaw and orthodox, you know, the way in which they move. But I mean in the sense that they can keep up that high pace that Ali was able to with such a fleet-footed style. But Usyk only has 2 knockouts as a heavyweight. Ali was stopping most of his opposition. He also fought George Chuvalo, who is probably the toughest man to ever lace up a pair of gloves. Had over 90 fights and was never dropped. And Ernie Terrell as well in the infamous What's My Name fight, where Ali punished Terrell over 15 rounds for refusing to call him Muhammad Ali. It's a real shame that Ali was banned in 67 because the Cleveland Williams performance that we saw in 1966, the 3-round demolition, is widely regarded as the greatest masterclass ever seen in a world title fight. He came back in 1970, and typically a fighter will take 3 years out for whatever reason these days and come back and take a real soft touch. But he instantly fought Jerry Quarry and Oscar Bonavena, 2 tough fights, before heading into the fight of the century against Joe Frazier. But in the late 60s, those were Muhammad Ali's years. Right, now moving on to the early 1960s. Now this is a tough era because Sonny Liston was tearing up the heavyweight contenders. Well, the entire heavyweight scene of the early 1960s. In one of the most underrated runs ever, he practically knocked out every leading contender. From Cleveland Williams in 1959 to Howard King in 1961, and then stopped Floyd Patterson twice in a row, both in the first round. I mean, it's devastating. But then there was the 1964 stoppage loss to Cassius Clay, who was then Cassius Clay before converting to Muhammad Ali. But whilst Liston was just an absolute wrecking ball, I'm not going to put him number one. Emil Griffith has a really strong case for being the greatest boxer of the entire 1960s. I mean, he was one of the most stacked resumes as well with Griffith. A middleweight champion multiple times, but in the early 60s, a multiple-time welterweight champion. In a tough era, the era of Luis Manuel Rodriguez, Ralph Dupas, Benny Paret. You know, these are names that aren't necessarily known as well, but Griffith was a great fighter. But I actually think the greatest fighter of the early 1960s is going to go to Ada Joffrey, the greatest bantamweight boxing's ever seen. Now, whilst on the topic of Ada Joffrey and the greatest bantamweights of all time, it's also worth mentioning the legendary Mexican Ruben Olivares, who went 61-0 towards the late 60s. A phenomenal fighter, 58 knockouts in that stretch too, and was the next great bantamweight after Ada Joffrey. But Ada Joffrey was phenomenal. Going into 1965, he was unbeaten in 50 fights, and he had successfully retained the bantamweight titles across the entire 5 years of the 1960s, from 60 to 64. Joffrey defeated Johnny Caldwell, Jose Medel multiple times, Bernardo Caraballo, and so many others in a really stacked bantamweight era. He was a perfect mix of brawler and excellent boxer, one of the most vicious body punchers in history, used to whip those body shots in, had Lomachenko-esque angles, could knock you out whilst making you miss on the back foot. Just an exceptional fighter. Across his entire career, he actually moved up to featherweight too. He had 78 fights. He only ever lost to one man in the Hall of Fame Japanese legend fighting Harada. And he had a record of 72-2 with 50 knockouts. But from 1960 to 1964, in my opinion, he was the best fighter in boxing. He went 18-0 with 17 knockouts in that stretch and ruled the bantamweight scene, successfully retaining the bantamweight title 8 times. Moving on to the 1950s, an absolutely brutal era. Now, Sugar Ray Robinson was awarded the Fighter of the Decade award for the 1950s. But a little spoiler alert, I'm not going to give him either of these slots. Undeniably the greatest boxer of all time in my opinion, more so because of what he did in the 1940s, his just unprecedented decade of dominance. The 1950s for Robinson were his middleweight years, where he regained the middleweight title 5 times. He did lose to Joey Maxim at light heavyweight early on, and lost to Ralph Jones and Randolph Turpin, also losing to Carmen Basilio, Paul Pender and Gene Fullmer within the decade. But the 50s enhanced Robinson's legacy because beyond the dominance, they showed that he had the grit and the determination and the toughness to bounce back from defeats and regain his spot at the top. But for the late 1950s, I'm going to go with boxing's ageless warrior, Archie Moore. His story alone is phenomenal. He didn't even get a title shot until he was 38 years of age, and he was fighting so many avoided killers before that. He He had over 20 fights against Hall of Famers by the time he was 38. And reports suggest he could have even been older when he had that title shot against Joey Maxim. He held it for 10 years, up to his 50th birthday, close to his 50th birthday. From 1955 to 1959, Archie Moore, as light heavyweight champion of the world, had a record of 30 wins, 2 defeats and 1 draw, with 19 KOs within the time. Now, the 2 defeats in this time were when he moved up to heavyweight to challenge Floyd Patterson and Rocky Marciano for the heavyweight title, both in which he'd lost. But as a light heavyweight, he was the king, and he beat so many top fighters and Hall of Famers in what, along with Bernard Hopkins, is the greatest career of a fighter beyond the age of 40. He stopped Bobo Olsen, beat Nino Valdez and stopped Harold Johnson in 14 rounds. Harold Johnson's a legendary fighter. But most impressively were his victories against Yvonne Durrell. Yvonne Durrell was an absolute tank of a fighter, and he dropped Archie Moore 4 times in their first fight over a sustained beating. Moore, in his mid-40s, maybe even his late 40s, depending on which age you take, dug through, climbed off the canvas 4 times to come back and seal an 11th round knockout in the greatest comeback in boxing history. I can't recall another fight in which I've seen where, you know, the comeback is so dramatic. And then he defeated Yvonne Durrell in a rematch, sparking him in 3 rounds the following year. Archie Moore's story is unbelievable. He's probably got the most stacked resume in history when you consider the fact that in the 40s he boxed the Black Murderers Row, Ezra Charles a bunch of times, Charlie Burley. In this time period alone, Floyd Patterson and Rocky Marciano, Joey Maxim, Yvonne Durrell, Muhammad Ali, when Muhammad Ali was up and coming. Archie Moore is a legendary fighter. Ended up retiring with 220 fights, 186 wins, and the most knockouts of a world champion in boxing history, 132. Now, the early 50s belonged to Rocky Marciano. Rocky went 23-0 with 20 knockouts from 1950 to 1954. This was the time in which he was up and coming, where he beat some of his more underrated names on his resume. You got guys like Rex Lane. Rex Lane was a good contender in the early 1950s heavyweight scene. You got Roland Estaza, another tough contender, and aging Joe Louis. And then, of course, the likes of Lee Savold, Harry Matthews, but then, of course, Jersey Joe Walcott for the heavyweight title. I think many people forget that Rocky didn't just beat once, but twice. And then, again, another former heavyweight champion, Cesar Charles, who is one of the greatest boxers of all time when you actually break down his resume. I mean, Cesar Charles is so underrated. His prime years are light heavyweight, and even the years in which he was a heavyweight champion are phenomenal. In 1955, Marciano would complete his legacy with a win over Archie Moore and Don Cockle. Now, one of the arguments people say about Rocky Marciano in his prime and the fighters he fought, that they were old and they were past their best. I don't think that's true necessarily. I think it's true with Joe Louis, don't get me wrong, but Jersey Joe Walcott had just come off one of the great knockouts against Cesar Charles for the heavyweight title. He was still in good form. Cesar Charles, you could ultimately say, was showing signs of slowing down, but he had just absolutely blown away Bob Satterfield, one of the 1950s legendary punchers, and was good enough to take Rocky Marciano to 15 rounds. The only guy to take Rocky Marciano the full championship distance in his career. And Archie Moore, who we've already touched upon, who I feel, after the Marciano fight, was the best fighter across those 5 years. So I think Rocky gets a bit of a hard time with his level of opposition. I think those guys are all-time greats. Charles maybe a little past his best. Lewis undeniably past his best. But, you know, those 3 names in Charles, Moore and Jersey Joe Walcott are still extremely formidable fighters that, you know, on the most part, he beat multiple times, and with Archie Moore, he stopped him. The 1940s. Now, I'm going to ruin this one straight away and just say I am giving the entire decade to Sugar Ray Robinson, who performed an unprecedented act of dominance across these 10 years. However, I have to cover the honourable mentions because I feel the 1940s are the most stacked decade in boxing history. You had the rise of Sandy Sadler, who stopped Willie Pep a bunch of times and became featherweight champion. Willie Pep, one of the all-time great fighters, who went on a 62 fight unbeaten streak as champion, survived a plane crash and then went 72 fights unbeaten. Cesar Charles himself, who completely obliterated the light heavyweight scene, beat Archie Moore a few times, Joey Maxim, Charlie Burley. You know, Cesar Charles is such an underrated fighter. To then go on and beat Joe Louis, end his unprecedented reign of dominance at heavyweight, and Jersey Joe Walcott, and nearly beat Marciano. The 40s are just so stacked. You've got Joe Louis himself, all of the guys in the Black Murderers row. You know, Charlie Burley being a standout. You've got Jimmy Bivens at light heavyweight, Harold Johnson. There's so many fighters in the 40s. But Joe Louis was practically heavyweight champion across the entire decade, which just cements how good Robinson was, standing out like this from 1940 to 1949. Now, across his first 40 fights, in his early 20s, Robinson went on a Hall of Fame-worthy career where he beat world champions Marty Servo, Fritzy Zivic, Sammy Angot, a lot of lightweight champions and future welterweight champions, before he ultimately lost to Jake LaMotta. He then went 90 fights unbeaten, extending his record to roughly 128 wins to 1 defeat, with over 80 knockouts in that time. Robinson's official record from 1940 to 1949 is 101 wins to 1 defeat, 2 draws and 66 knockouts. He had completely dominated the welterweight division, defeating all-time great fighters in Kid Gavilan multiple times, Jake LaMotta multiple times, and aging Henry Armstrong. And his 1950s run would see him become the middleweight champion of the world, a title in which he would win on 5 separate occasions. Moving on to the late 1930s, these years were ruled by Joe Louis. Joe Louis won the Fighter of the Year award 3 different times within this 5-year window. But he isn't my pick for the best fighter across 1935 to 1939. And in a sense, it seems wrong to not put Louis in, because I have Louis in my top 5 pound for pound of all time. However, the man that is entering or winning this section is my number 2 pound for pound of all time. Homicide Hank Henry Armstrong. Armstrong's form across 4 of these 5 years is painfully underrated. In my opinion, those 4 years are the greatest ever seen in boxing. Armstrong's record across the 5 years totals up to 72 wins, 7 defeats with 1 draw, scoring 55 brutal knockouts. And towards the start of his career, he did lose quite a lot of fights. I mean, he lost his first 4 fights. I believe he was stopped in his debut. And he lost 6 of these 7 fights within the first 2 years of this window. But across the last 3, he went on a tear-up of all tear-ups, in which he went 59 wins to 1 defeat and 1 draw with 51 knockouts. He had 27 fights in 1937 alone and won every single one, scoring 26 knockouts. Besides that, he went on a separate 27 fight knockout streak. But more impressively is the weight jumping feats and the title wins. In October 1937, he knocked out P.T. Saron to become the undisputed featherweight champion. 7 months later, he jumped the modern day equivalent of 5 divisions all the way up to welterweight and became the undisputed welterweight world champion, defeating one of the greatest fighters of all time in Barney Ross. In his very next fight, he moved down to lightweight and defeated the Hall of Fame champion Lou Ambers to become boxing's only ever simultaneous 3-division champion, across what is the modern day equivalent of 5 divisions. In his very next fight, he beat the future middleweight world champion Seferino Garcia, a man who he would rematch in this window for the middleweight title and would controversially score a draw in a fight that many thought he won. Is deemed one of boxing's worst ever robberies. Armstrong also successfully retained the welterweight titles 19 times within 22 months, which is still the record close to a century later. And in this time, he scored further wins against Hall of Famers in Pedro Montanez, Baby Arizmendi, Lou Jenkins, Bobby Pacho, and just so many other legendary fighters in what is, as I say, in my opinion, the greatest prime ever seen. Moving on to the early 1930s. The early 1930s in boxing was seen as the golden era of lightweights. There were so many legendary fighters in the lightweight division and in the lighter weight divisions that were amongst the very top of the sport. And it's one of the reasons Henry Armstrong's demolition of the lighter weights is so impressive towards the back end of the 1930s because these guys were legendary. You have Jimmy McClarnin, who across his career jumped from flyweight to welterweight, defeating 13 different Hall of Famers, the second most in history. Tony Canzonieri, a champion at 18 years of age, the first ever 3-division champion ever. But my number one is going to be Barney Ross, another 3-division champion with one of the most fascinating stories outside of the ring in history. Ross served in the Guadalcanal and had a really horrendous time in there, earning the Purple Heart and the Silver Star amongst many others. It's such an interesting story and his life is so fascinating. But as a fighter, his resume is amongst the most stacked in history. His entire record was 74 wins to 4 defeats with 3 draws in one of the toughest eras. Across the early 1930s, he had dominated so many different Hall of Famers across those 3 weight divisions. Ross had defeated the legendary fighters of Tony Canzonieri, Jimmy McClarnin, Billy Petroli, all multiple times in those years. And one of the things I love about this era is the names of some of these fighters. Guys like Battling Battolino, I mean, what a name. And it's just such a colourful era. I can't remember which particular fighter it was. It may have been Tony Canzonieri, but one of the fighters in one of these super fights in a golden era of boxing walked to the ring and the MC's microphone used to come down from the ceiling of the arena. And he knocked his head against the microphone and cut his eye before the fight, before a brutal 15-round war, and still took part in the fight with a cut already before the fight had even taken place. But Ross is my pick for this era, which takes me to the 1920s, which truly were the roaring 20s. Boxing had become the forefront of sports in America alongside baseball, and that is due to one man, Jack Dempsey, who, after absolutely massacring Jess Willard, encapsulated the audience like no one else that had ever lived before. Close to 100,000 people would attend Dempsey's fights in the 20s. He's the reason sports were broadcast live on radio. However, he's not going to be my pick in either of these eras. Although his influence is amongst the highest in the sport, his activity levels across the 1920s weren't particularly high. And especially towards the late 1920s, which is when he actually lost the title to the man that I'm going to put as my late 1920s winner, Gene Tunney. Gene Tunney defeated Jack Dempsey twice in 1926 and 1927 to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. It's a title in which he would only defend successfully once before retiring, TKOing Tom Heaney in the 11th round. But what cements Tunney as the number one in this time is his light heavyweight form, in which he KO'd Tommy Gibbons in 12 rounds, but most importantly, defeated Harry Greb for the third and final time of his career. Now, the relevance of that is Harry Greb was just an anomaly in boxing history. One of the most incredible fighters ever, potentially the greatest fighter of all time. But also, he was the only man that had ever defeated Gene Tunney, and in most people's eyes had deserved 2 victories against Gene Tunney, with the rematch being a controversial Tunney win. So in order to beat someone like Greb, Gibbons and Jack Dempsey twice, Tunney had absolutely revolutionised the sport. He had one defeat in 80 odd fights and had revolutionised the way in which heavyweights move. He was the first scientific heavyweight champion that had really used his brain, and he wasn't very popular because of it, because Jack Dempsey was a knockout machine that had lit up the 1920s. But Tunney, you can't argue with the dominance, and going 9-0 in this time period, scoring 5 knockouts, although not the most active, especially of the era, his dominance and his resume is legendary. My pick for the first 5 years of the 1920s is the Pittsburgh windmill Harry Greb. Now, a little bit of a spoiler, Greb could be the second fighter behind Sugar Ray Robinson to take back-to-back 5 years, culminating in an entire decade. But I'm not going to give him the late 1910s. I think there's someone that could just supersede Greb's form. But there's no denying that Harry Greb was the most dominant force in all of boxing across the early 1920s. This is when he finally won the middleweight world title after 240 contests as a professional. Across these 5 years, Greb went 83-5-5, scoring just 16 knockouts, but that doesn't matter because Greb was consistently dominating Hall of Famers from welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight and heavyweight. He was coming off of a 1919 in which he went 45-0, scoring 11 victories against Hall of Famers in that year alone. But during the 20s, the early 20s, he defeated Tommy Gibbons multiple times, Tommy Loughran multiple times, fought Gene Tunney 5 times, and deserved 2 victories but got one, the only man to ever defeat Gene Tunney. Moved up to face one of the most fearsome light heavyweights in Kid Norfolk, a man who actually blinded him permanently in one eye in that fight. And won the world title off of Johnny Wilson, the middleweight world championship, defeating him multiple times. He also was in the fight of the decade in the 1920s against fearsome welterweight and future middleweight champion Mickey Walker, winning an absolute brawl in 15 rounds, nearly stopping the legendary Walker in the 14th, and 2 weeks later defeated the light heavyweight Hall of Famer Maxie Rosenblum over again 15 rounds. Greb was closing into 300 fights by 1925. He eventually had his last fight in 1926, which he sadly passed away in 1926 due to nose surgery after a car crash. He fought the incredible Tiger Flowers 3 times, who he ultimately beat as well in the 1925 and 1926 campaign. And from 1919 to 1924, which he was the best fighter in the world, just cemented his name as the greatest middleweight boxing's ever seen. But not only that, cemented himself also as one of the greatest light heavyweights ever seen, defeating so many of the legends there. And furthermore, cemented himself as the leading contender for Jack Dempsey's heavyweight title. Just a phenomenal fighter. Now, the late 1910s, as I mentioned, could easily be Harry Greb. He went 45-0 in 1919 alone, scored many of his victories over his 15 career Hall of Famers, defeated the most in history. But I'm going to give this one to the ghetto wizard Benny Leonard, who, as I touched upon earlier, has a very strong case for being the greatest lightweight ever. Leonard went 98-5-3 with 39 knockouts within these 5 years, but 4 of those defeats came in the first 2 years. In the last 3, he lost just once in 68 fights and ultimately extended that into the early 1920s, which is where he was voted the fighter of the decade. Leonard as a complete fighter was just decades ahead of his time. Often regarded as having one of the greatest ring IQs ever seen, Leonard won the world lightweight title in 1917, holding it for the remainder of these years well into the 1920s. He beat many Hall of Famers, including Jack Britton multiple times, Johnny Dundee, Johnny Kilbane, Ted Kid Lewis, and just so many others in a really brutal era. When Leonard hit his prime as a lightweight champion in the late 10s and 20s, he would lose just twice in over 110 straight fights, one of which was a disqualification, consistently fighting Hall of Fame level. Barring a few rounds of footage we have against his 1922 defence against Lou Tendler, all the other footage we have of Leonard is way past his prime, and you can still see his freakish defence for the time, against none other than the Hall of Famer Jimmy McClarnin. Leonard is just an unbelievable all-time great fighter, and is still held by many experts as the greatest lightweight boxing's ever seen. He was just a master at judging the ring, and one of the most dominant champions the sport's ever seen in his prime. The early 1910s is going to go to the only flyweight in this list, and subsequently the only British fighter in this list, Jimmy Wilde, the Welsh Atom. They used to call him the ghost with the hammer in his hands. It was widely believed he was too small for flyweight. Regardless, from 1910 to 1914, Wilde went 94-0 with 1 draw and 65 knockouts. Wilde was extremely fast, but most notably extremely powerful. Throughout these 5 years, he accumulated the largest unbeaten streak we have in recorded boxing history. Wilde was the British champion during these years, and there wasn't actually a flyweight world title available. When they made a flyweight world championship, Wilde was the first man to ever win it, and it speaks volumes that over 100 years after his career is finished, he's still widely regarded by the Ring magazine as the greatest flyweight of all time. The man had close to 100 knockouts by the time his career ended and was just an absolute phenomenon. always giving weight away too, always fighting fighters weighing in at bantamweight, sometimes even featherweight, whilst himself weighing under the flyweight limit. Moving on to the late 1900s, this is going to go to the Boston bone crusher Sam Langford, whose weight jumping feats in this time were just absolutely insane. Langford in 1903 as a 17-year-old had beaten the great lightweight Joe Gans, who at the time was considered the greatest boxer to ever live, and still over 120 years later is regarded as a top 3 lightweight of all time. Langford as a 17-year-old beat him over 15 rounds. In the following year, he took Barbados Joe Walcott, the welterweight champion, to a draw, in which many thought he won. But it's in these 5 years from 05 to 09 in which he just performs the most unbelievable weight jumping feats. He goes from welterweight and defeats young Peter Jackson, who was the man who beat Barbados Joe Walcott, the champion, and he beats the Hall of Fame boxer Jack Blackburn multiple times. Jack Blackburn was also Joe Louis's legendary trainer. He then jumps all the way up to heavyweight and outpoints the future heavyweight Hall of Famer Joe Jeanette, before taking Jack Johnson, the future heavyweight champion of the world, 15 rounds. Around these years, Langford also defeated the likes of young Peter Jackson multiple times, another heavyweight in Sandy Ferguson, fireman Jim Flynn, a heavyweight who was the only man to knock out Jack Dempsey in the first round. And going into the 1910s, he would add wins over Tiger Flowers, Stanley Ketchel, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. These are all Hall of Famers that are ranging from lightweight to heavyweight. In total, he had more fights against world champions and Hall of Famers than anyone else in history, having over 60 fights against opponents that either held a world title or were inducted into the Hall of Fame. And last but not least, 1900 to 1904. Now, I'm not going to dig into the 1800s. You give a shout out to Bob Fitzsimmons. In that era, you have the likes of George Dixon, the first ever black world champion in history. You have John L. Sullivan, the first ever world heavyweight champion. There's so many fighters, but I'm just going to keep it to the 20th century and beyond. For 1900 to 1904, I am going with the old master, Joe Gans. Joe Gans is one of boxing's most influential pioneers, a lightweight champion who held one of the longest reigns in history and is still regarded as one of the greatest lightweight champions of all time. Across 1900 to 1904, he was the most dominant fighter in boxing, having a record of 65 to 4 and 6 with 52 knockouts within those 5 years alone. Now, he was the lightweight champion. He'd won the title all the way back in 1902, where he beat the Hall of Famer Frank Hearn. There were wins over the likes of George McFadden. There were multiple instances in which Gans would have to fight 2 to 3 times a day. In the biggest fight of the decade against Battling Nelson, he gained a grueling victory after 42 brutal rounds. He is widely regarded as the man who invented the jab. You can see instances in which he's using the shoulder roll, judging distance, and he was just a phenomenal fighter. He ultimately retired with a record of 160 wins to 12 defeats, 21 draws, and he's in the illustrious 100 knockouts club with 101 career knockouts. In these years, there were further victories against the legendary Jack Blackburn too. And of course, there was that loss to a 17-year-old Sam Langford, which we have to take into account. But Gans was widely regarded as the greatest fighter to ever live at this point. And those are my greatest fighters across every 5 years of the entire history of this sport beyond the 20th century. Now, there are obviously fighters that fall through the cracks. It's not foolproof, but hopefully you enjoyed the format. Hopefully it gives you a wider view on some of history's greatest fighters through the eras. And ultimately, all of these guys are in the Hall of Fame and are all-time greats. But lots of them don't get talked about because they weren't necessarily the fighter of the decade over another. Anyway, if you like the content, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. It really does help.